Adam Bandt, welcome to the program.
Hi, David.
So inflation is still at 7.8%, highest it's been in more than 30 years. What's your answer to bringing it down?
Well, it's not everyday people who are driving inflation. It's not wages that's driving inflation. As your panel and some of the evidence mentioned, you've got the Commonwealth Bank posting record profits off the back of interest rates going up. It is corporate profiteering that is going a large way to driving inflation. That's something the government can do something about. The government can also step in and relieve some of the cost of living pressure on people by doing things like a national plan to freeze rents, looking at getting dental into Medicare to relieve some of the cost of living pressures on people. Government's got a lot of levers at its disposal. It's not pulling them at the moment, and it needs to revisit the stage 3 tax cuts. That's $250 billion.
Okay, so that's next year. But
right now, it's a big black hole in the budget that everything is like, it's pulling everything into its gravitational field.
But right now you are saying cap rents and increase corporate taxes.
Yeah, look at these big banks, these big gas corporations that are driving up energy prices. Freeze electricity bills. We've just given the government the power to do that at the end of last year. And we can fund it by making these big corporations pay their fair share of tax. That will not only help with inflation, it'll help everyday people deal with the cost of living crisis.
I mean, the reality is, as the Reserve Bank Governor pointed out, is you need legislation for all of these things. Good luck getting those things through Parliament. It would take quite some time. In the meantime, your colleague Nick McKim has called on the Treasurer to step in and override the Reserve Bank and reverse this latest interest rate rise. Is that a serious suggestion?
Well, the government does have the ultimate power to do this.
You're saying they should?
Well, it could do more than jawboning, right? And it can, at the moment, the interest rate rises are a very blunt tool, as your panellists said, when every problem looks, when all you've got is a hammer and every problem looks like a nail.
But should the Treasurer really override the Reserve Bank?
Well, the government has to look at what powers it's got and does have to look at whether now's the right time to step in, because this is hurting people and it's pushing the country closer to a recession.
Are you saying they should, though?
Well, the government does have to look at it because it's serious. They've got the power to do this because they've got other powers as well. At the moment, there's a lot of hand-wringing from the government, a lot of hand-wringing about this, but they're not pulling any of the levers that they can, and they're letting these big corporations continue to drive up inflation through corporate profiteering, and they're not doing what they should.
Do you support an independent Reserve Bank?
It needs to act within the guidelines of that the Parliament sets it, and having an independent Reserve Bank is important, but what are its goals? At the moment, its goals seem to be to keep pushing up interest rates regardless of the pain, because that's the only tool that it's got. And if the relationship between the government and the Reserve Bank is set in law in a way that makes everyday people pay the cost of problems that they haven't caused, then it does need a re-looking at. Yes, the government is looking at doing a review to look at the relationship between the Reserve Bank and the government. That's good, but that needs to actually look at the levers the government has as well.
Let's turn to climate change. The government says its planned changes to the safeguards mechanism will take some 200 million tonnes of carbon emissions out of the atmosphere. Would you seriously vote against that?
Well, let's look at that. All right, coal and gas are the main causes of the climate crisis. Any effective climate policy should bring down pollution from coal and gas. Labor's policy doesn't do that. In fact, it gets worse, right?
So it doesn't reduce emissions at all? No.
Look at what happens with coal and gas. Labor's own documents say pollution from gas is going to keep going up. Why? Because that 200 million tonnes that they're talking about, it could all just be on paper, because coal and gas pollution gets to keep going up as long as they buy tree planting permits on the other side of the country. And that's why it makes the problem worse. But B, what the safeguard mechanism does, as proposed by Labor, is allow unlimited new coal and gas mines to come into the system. Now, those coal and gas mines that are on the books at the moment are so big, it will wipe out any gains that are made from there. So they talk about maybe 200 million tonnes. That might all be on paper, maybe 200 million tonnes. Open up the Northern Territory gas fields, which Labor is talking about at the moment, and you are talking about 34 billion tonnes of pollution, new pollution going into the atmosphere. That's our concern. And that's why we've said, to come to your question, we've put an offer, not an ultimatum. It's an offer that says we'll put aside our very real concerns with the Ponzi scheme elements of this plan where everything gets offset. We'll put aside the fact that we think you've got a low target that is going to mean the end of the Great Barrier Reef and that you're reheating Tony Abbott's safeguard mechanism. We will vote for it in full tomorrow if you do one thing. Stop making the problem worse. Stop opening new coal and gas projects, because you can't put the fire out while you're pouring petrol on it.
Has any other country banned new coal and gas projects?
Well, this is what the International Energy Agency.
Yeah, I know that.
The United Nations Secretary General, the world scientists.
Has anyone done it?
They're all saying this is what we've got to do. At the last
Has anyone done it? Was the question?
At the last Global Climate Summit, the UK, who was hosting that, they went along and they said, this has to be the summit that we start to talk about not opening any...
Sorry, my question was, has any country done this?
Well, I know some countries have certainly looked at it. I don't know that there's anyone taking the step yet, but Australia, as the third largest exporter of fossil fuel pollution, has a special responsibility, right? We can't ask other countries to do what we're not prepared to do ourselves.
Well, arguably that makes it harder economically for Australia. But the question was, coming back to the question, has any other country done this? You're not sure whether anyone's done it.
Well, someone's got to do it. Someone's got to go first. Our Pacific Island neighbours are pleading with us to stop opening new coal and gas projects, right? There will have to come a time, David, in human history, if we're to tackle the climate crisis, where we say we're not going to open any more, right? Now,
what would it cost? Do you know any work done on what that would cost Australia?
Yeah, we ran to the election with a costed platform that said, looking at the royalties that would be coming into the federal government from the coal and gas projects, bearing in mind that we're not talking about existing ones, we're talking about new ones. Look at the damage that's going to be caused from the floods and the fires and the droughts if the climate crisis gets worse, and how much is being spent by communities at the moment just dealing with all of that. It's the only way to save our economy at the moment.
And what was that cost?
Well, we're talking about, in terms of foregone royalty, you're talking, from memory, somewhere in the order of hundreds of millions of dollars, right? Hundreds of millions of dollars, because bear in mind that these big gas corporations, 27 big gas corporations, brought in $77 billion of income in 1 year and paid no tax on it, right? The ATO has called these big gas corporations serial tax avoiders. That's why the hit to the economy is nowhere near as much as these corporations are making out. But the benefit, it's costing farmers, on average, $30,000 a year. At the moment, that's the climate crisis.
Okay, let me just come back to...
It's a net benefit to the economy.
The decision you've got to make here, you mentioned again here that this is an offer you're making, not an ultimatum.
Yes.
So is that a suggestion really, or is it a red line? Coming back again to this question, would you really vote against this plan?
Well, it's a proposal to Labor to say we'll pass your scheme in full. If you, Labor, think it's so important to keep opening new coal and gas projects in a climate crisis...
If they say no, and they're saying no...
Well, I don't think that position is ultimately tenable, and I don't think the government, the penny has quite dropped with the government how much things have moved on. 66% of people between 18 and 34 back our position, don't want new coal and gas mines open. 57% of the general population, right? Things have moved on. I know Labor talks a lot about history, but the students who are marching in the streets at the moment behind banners saying no new coal and gas were in primary school in 2009.
Well, yeah.
They do not want... No one can understand why, we're coming up to the year anniversary of the floods in Lismore, people cannot understand why Labor says that they want to open up new projects.
And clearly you campaigned very strongly on this. So with this negotiation, if you don't get something from the government, if you don't walk away from this with some movement from the government on new coal and gas projects, are you worried some of those who voted Greens will wonder what's the point of the party?
Oh, look, we're obviously a fair way away from seeing what happens here. We've put a position, and it's now up to Labor.
The point is you've got to get something, though, haven't you?
Well, B, I think people can see that we're the only ones in Parliament at the moment fighting to stop coal and gas mines being opened.
And if you don't get something for that fight, again, what's the point of the Greens?
Well,
right?
Why does Labor want to go to the wall to open new coal and gas projects? These are huge climate bombs. They've got I think it's an untenable task.
I'm just talking about the Greens, though. For your party, this is a high-stakes moment, right? And for your leadership.
People know that we are fighting our hardest to stop Labor opening new coal and gas mines. There's 118 in the pipeline. Labor's own papers say they want to open at least 6 of these or 7 of these new massive gas fields under the safeguard mechanism. People know that we are in there fighting. That's what they expect us to do. And let's remember the last election. Labor's vote went backwards, right? The Coalition's vote went backwards. The Greens and the Independents, whose vote went up, said it's time to stop opening new coal and gas. That penny has to drop with the government at some point.
Let me just ask you a couple of compromise options here, and we'll try not to get too technical on the changes here to the safeguards mechanism. The Climate Council is saying, what about pausing new coal and gas until the EPBC Act, the Environmental Approvals Act, is toughened? Would you support that?
I think that's a proposal that's worth having a look at. I mean, we've already compromised a lot, and we've said we'll compromise on targets, we will compromise on how quickly we're going to make the change, we'll compromise on the offsets. There's one thing we're asking for: don't make the problem worse. Some others have put proposals like that.
I'm just going to run a couple of others past you. The Australia Institute, it's also put forward an idea. You've got concerns about the offsets, and so do many people. What if companies could still put their money into an offset or put it into a dedicated fund for decarbonisation that the government would control? So you know the money's, you have some greater surety that the money's going to be well spent.
Look, we're up for good faith discussions, and proposals like that are coming from people like the Climate Council, from the Australia Institute. I've seen the Australian Conservation Foundation out this week saying there's serious design problems with the government's proposal. What about putting a climate trigger in our environment laws, for example? All of those things are things that we would look at, right?
Okay.
And you've seen in the past, like we didn't support the government's climate targets, but we managed to land a place and pass the climate bill. Electric vehicle legislation, the energy legislation last year that reserves gas domestically, we had concerns about that, but we passed it.
And just
we're
finally,
prepared to have those.
It sounds like you're open for some compromise here and getting something from the government. Is there a prospect too, just finally, of cross trading? You're also battling the government on their National Reconstruction Fund and their Social Housing Fund. Could you see a scenario where they give you a bit more on something else to get you over the line on this?
Well, 2 things. One is that one of the things that ties some of those policies together is that Labor's policies are making things worse at the moment. They stand to make the problems worse, and we're trying to stop that. But secondly, look, it has to deal with this question of coal and gas, right? It has to deal with this question of new coal and gas mines. There's no justification for opening them up in a climate crisis. You can't put the fire out while you're pouring petrol on it. First step in fixing a problem is stop making it worse. We're up for the good faith discussions. The onus is now on Labor to explain why it wants more coal and gas in a climate crisis.
Adam Bandt, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks, David.